Hi, today I'm making sauerkraut, and I would go through the process because it's a super easy ferment that is really high in vitamin C. So it's great for the immune system as well as gut health. And it's one of the easiest ferments to make. Really, the only things you need are cabbage, salt, and your hands. I'm going to make a variety that I enjoy that also involves dried cherries and a little bit of turmeric. But you can really flavor sauerkraut any way you like. You can make it spicy with hot peppers. You can make it with dill or juniper or other flavors. It's a really versatile ferment that you can flavor in any way you like. So the first thing to remember to do before you start chopping the cabbage is to take one of these outer leaves off. And that's going to be crucial later on in the process. So I'm just going to leave that here and we'll come back to that leaf later. The cabbages have been sitting in the fridge for quite a while, so they're at their peak freshness, which is okay for fermentation. You don't want your vegetables to be rotting, but it is a good use if they're starting to get a little bit yellow or a little bit like soggy in the fridge. Your fermentation process can help bring them a second life. So it's a nice way to use older vegetables that have been sitting around a while. And really the thing that we're going to do here is we're going to take off the bottom, the base, and create a kind of flat surface to chop the cabbage on. And then you'll cut it in half. And you see when you cut it in half that there's like a little bit of a heart here in the middle, the stem that comes up into the cabbage. You're welcome to keep that in your sauerkraut. It's going to be a little bit harder and denser than the rest of the cabbage though. So I like to take it out. And the way that I do that is I then quarter the cabbage, and that gives you a good look at where the heart comes in. And then at an angle, I just take the knife and remove that heart. And that's great for making soup stocks or, just putting in the compost. You can also cook that up, slice it thin and put it in stir fries. Or you can leave it in there and just know that you'll have some different textures in your sauerkraut. So I'm going to do that on all four sides. And then you're basically going to chop your cabbage finely, like you would coleslaw or something like that, and make sure that your fingers are safe in the process. So now you have the salt, and really, if you want to be precise, you can weigh, if you have a kitchen scale, you can weigh your cabbage and you can weigh your salt. You want about 11 grams of salt per pound of cabbage. But I weighed these cabbages and they were about 2 pounds each. And then I weighed the salt, and that meant that about a heaping tablespoon of salt is going to be the right amount of salt per cabbage. It really depends on the salt that you're using. Also, I'm using a fine sea salt. If you were using a coarse kosher salt or like more of a rock salt, something with a bigger grain, then you're going to want more of a heaping tablespoon. And then if you are putting in any kind of dry spices or even like fresh turmeric at this point, you could add that in. I have a dried turmeric from Holulu Aina. Shout out to Holulu Aina. And I'm going to just sort of sprinkle, this is maybe a teaspoon of dried turmeric on there. The other great thing to do with turmeric is to add a little bit of ground pepper into there. The pepper actually helps to make the curcumins, which is the anti-inflammatory and healthy agents in turmeric, to be more bioavailable to your body. So if you just add a little bit of black pepper every time you use turmeric, it's a good trick to help get all the goodness of the turmeric into your body. This is going to dye your hands yellow, so be prepared for that. But at this point, what you want to do is really get in there and mix the salt and the spice around in the cabbage. But what you're also doing is kind of giving it a really rigorous massage. And the point of your rigorous massage of the cabbage is to start to break down the cell walls and release some of the moisture in the cabbage. Because ultimately, in order to create the environment for the lactic acid producing bacteria, which is what's going to ferment this cabbage. We need the cabbage to be underwater. And so in this ferment, we're not adding any water. It's not going to be a brine where we're adding water. All of the water is actually going to come out from the cabbage itself. So we need to get enough liquid out of this cabbage so that the cabbage can be submerged in the fermentation vessel and stay out of contact with the air. So a good trick with that I've learned is rather than putting all of your energy into smushing up the cabbage until it gets liquidy, is to just leave it alone for about 15 minutes and the salt starts to pull out the moisture for you. So it's a lot less labor intensive. So here I've let it sit for about 15 minutes and you can see that if you look down at the bottom of the bowl, there's a little bit of liquid pooling there. So that's a good sign that your cabbage is ready to be potted up. Or if you take a handful and you squeeze it, you can see all of that liquid is starting to flow out of it. So that's awesome. That's what we want it to be in that stage. And at this point, I'm going to add a little bit of dried cherries. So that's going to give it kind of a sweetness. This is going to be kind of a sweet sauerkraut. And this is really just sort of to your taste, however much dried fruit you want to add to it. And mix those in. I like to mix those in at the end because I don't really want to squish the cherries. It's a good indicator. I really like to use my own senses when I'm fermenting. So we want the salt in a direct salt ferment like this, where you're not using a brine, you're just doing salt directly on the vegetable. We want the salt level to be at about 2.5% salt to vegetable. And ocean water is about 3% salinity. So if you taste this, it should kind of taste like if you took a sip of ocean water. It should be saltier than you would want to eat, like something on your plate, but it shouldn't be like so salty that you're like, oh, I don't want to have that in my mouth at all. So that's a good kind of body indicator to see if you're on the right track. It's also, it really depends on the weather and the conditions in your house, and how fast you want to eat the ferment. So the less salt, the faster the fermentation process is going to go. But you want to have enough salt in there. Only the lactic acid producing bacteria are going to thrive in there and no other bacteria are going to thrive in there. So that's the purpose of the salt. If it's hotter, if it's the middle of the summer, and it's really warm in your kitchen, then the fermentation process is going to happen faster naturally. So you might want to use a little more salt. So you'll figure it out as you start to ferment and see about the conditions in your own place. I'm going to put this sauerkraut into a jar. You can use lots of different vessels for fermentation. You just don't want to use any kind of metal because the salt will react with the metal, but you can use glass, you can use ceramic. A mason jar is really easy and useful for fermentation purposes. So if you have a wide mouth fermentation jar, that's an easy one to use. And it's going to look like way too much cabbage to fit into this jar, but we're going to really pack it down in there, and that's going to help it submerge under the liquid. So you can kind of just take handfuls of it at a time and push them into the jar. And then once you have some in there, my hand fits in a wide mouth jar. I know that not everyone's hands fit in there. If your hand does, you can just stick your hand in there, assuming it's clean, and smash it down with your knuckles until you start to see the liquid form above the level of the cabbage. And then you can add another layer. If your hand does not fit in a wide mouth jar, you can get another implement. Like this is a tamper, but you could use like a wooden spoon or some other kind of implement. It's okay to use metal implements at this point. You just don't want to ferment for long periods of time in metal. But if you have something that you can stick down in the jar and start to smash it down, that works just as well. Once the liquid comes above the level of the cabbage, you're ready to do another layer. And you don't want to fill your jar all the way to the top, because during the fermentation process, you're going to be having the lactic acid bacteria eating the sugars in the cabbage, and they're going to be producing lactic acid, which is what makes it sour. They're also going to be producing carbon dioxide, which is going to come off in the form of bubbles, and that's going to kind of like bubble the liquid out of it. So you don't want to go all the way to the top, because then you're going to have a mess. So you can see that whole bowl of cabbage pretty much fit in this one mason jar. So it's pretty impressive how much it shrinks down. So once I get all of my cabbage squished down in there, and you can really tell that it's gonna have enough liquid in there that it can stay submerged. If it didn't, I would add the rest of this liquid in there too. But this really seems like enough liquid. Now we go back to that leaf that we took off from the outside of the cabbage to start with. And what this is going to do is it's going to provide like a blanket on top, because anything that's floating on the surface of the liquid and is exposed to air can mold. And that's not ideal. It's not the end of the world if that happens. If you have this blanket weighing everything else down, what you can do is just take off the moldy parts and throw those out. But anything that's been submerged under the liquid won't be moldy and will still be good to eat. So if your outer leaf has like a thick kind of vein running through it, you might want to just sort of take that out because it's a little hard to squish down in here. And I'll move it onto this cutting board in case it overflows. But you're going to fold up your outer cabbage leaf and squish it down in there. Ideally, you want the cabbage leaf to also itself be submerged under the liquid. Otherwise, it's going to mold, which again is not the end of the world, because that's the purpose of having this barrier between the ferment that you're going to eat and the air, so that if anything molds, it's going to be this cabbage blanket, and you can just pull that out and throw it out. And there you go. So you can kind of tuck it in on the sides so that it doesn't float up to the surface. And you can see that the liquid is still covering up all of the cabbage, including the cabbage barrier blanket. And then this is actually pretty solid in here, but what I often do is then add a weight or something to just weight down the ferment and make sure that the cabbage doesn't start floating after a few days' time. So I have a little weight here that's made for that purpose, but you could use a smaller jar. And if the jar isn't heavy enough, you could fill the jar with a little bit of water to weight it down here. Okay, and then the last thing to do is you want to make sure to put your ferment on a plate, because it might be overflowing as time goes on. And if you just have it on your counter, you're going to have a puddle of sauerkraut juice. What I like to do to cover mine, there are lots of different ways to cover it. There's like airlocks that are specifically made for this purpose, but what you can actually do is just grab a cloth or even like a paper towel, put it over the top, and then rubber band it so that the gases can come out and get released, but nothing else is going inside of the jar while it's fermenting. You can actually put the lid back on at this point if you want to, but what I would recommend is not tightening it down all the way. Leave it like a quarter turn loose, and then burp it once a day, because the gas is going to be expanding in there and you don't want to have an explosion. So you need to remove the cap at least once a day and let that gas expand. You can leave this on your counter at room temperature. Again, it's going to depend on your weather and how warm it is in your kitchen, but somewhere between a week and 3 weeks, probably, depending on your taste too. So you can taste it as time goes on. If it still just tastes like cabbage, it's not ready yet. If it's tasting sour, you can sort of get to know your taste buds and know at what point of sourness you enjoy eating it. It's going to get more sour as time goes on. So once it's to your sourness liking, you want to take it and put it in the refrigerator, and that's going to slow down the fermentation process almost to a stop so that it stays good and at that sourness level for months and months at a time. But that's how to make sauerkraut. I wanted to share this with folks because it's a practice that we do in our house regularly, and especially during these times when access to fresh vegetables is more challenging. When you do have fresh vegetables and you want to make them last longer and you want to get more nutrients out of them, fermentation is a really good way to do that, because it'll make your cabbages last for months and months. But also the fermentation process does, it's sort of like the microbes in the fermentation process are pre-digesting the vegetables, so you get a lot more nutrients and vitamins out of it. So vitamin C is one of the things that sauerkraut makes really available to your body, and it's great for the immune system. Let me know if you guys have any questions in the comments below. I'm happy to share these fermentation stories with you.